Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are on day 128 of the war with Gaza, day 127 of the war with Lebanon, and day 124 with the Houthis. All of these different wars are going on simultaneoly. They all start back on the 7th of October, and since then, IDF forces have been operating in the different arenas. In the south, really the main thing to update on for the last 72 hours since our last briefing is the exposure by the IDF and by Israel of the Hamas tunnels underneath the schools of UNRWA and the headquarters of UNRWA. This is not something that could have been haphazard. This was a lot of noise to dig a tunnel which was over a kilometer long that was then connected by electricity from UNRWA headquarters into the Hamas tunnels. This is not something that, as Philip Lazzarini could have, the head of UNRWA could have argued, we just didn't know. Unless you were going like this and going like this and not doing anything, you were the three monkeys. You saw this happening. You heard the construction around you, underneath you, everywhere around it surrounded them, and yet UNRWA claims that it didn't know. And IDF forces have been carrying on, and they've been exposing these attack tunnels and Hamas assets all the way through the Gaza Strip. They're operating now intensively in Khan Yunis, which is one of the second to last Hamas stronghold in the Gaza Strip. Next stop will be Rafah, which is on the southern border. It's the last bastion of Hamas. It's where their last two battalions are still holding out. There we have a complicated situation. Rafah is on the border and is really separated in two parts by the border between us and Egypt. The Egyptians, who have been actively helping Hamas smuggle in both engineering equipment to dig these tunnels and weaponry, that was in the period leading up to October 7, are now saying that if Israel operates on a large scale in Rafah, then they will suspend the peace accords. This is something which is obviously going to have to develop, and we're going to have to coordinate something with Egypt. There's no way that we can allow the Egyptians, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has already said, no one else will be able to dictate to us whether we can or cannot destroy Hamas, and destroying Hamas in Rafah is an integral part of the plan. Moving to the north, we've seen the continuation of the war of attrition. Hezbollah continues to fire rockets and anti-tank missiles. A direct hit yesterday in Kiryat Shmone, on one of the Israel's obviously most northern cities that has been entirely evacuated. We're still talking about 100,000 people from our north that are living in suitcases, refugees in their own country, displaced people in their own country. Those are the refugees that you never hear about. UNRWA and the UN aren't providing support for all of the Israelis. There's some 200,000 Israelis displaced from their homes, whether it be from the south around Gaza or from the north. No one's talking about them or an international effort to support them, to fund them, and to cater to them. That's obviously all Israel's problem. All the world sees is the Palestinians in Gaza. Whether they did or did not support Hamas for them is irrelevant, and whether the aid gets to them or whether it goes straight to Hamas is also irrelevant. From the south, there's nothing really new to report from the Houthis. They are continuing on with their aggression and being faced off by the US-led coalition. In Judea and Samaria, the terror attacks have continued on. Let no one have any be misguided. There are constant terror attacks in Judea and Samaria, whether it be shooting attacks, whether it be throwing of Molotov cocktails, just terrorist activities at its highest levels that we've seen for a very long time. IDF forces now having arrested 3,200 terrorists in Judea and Samaria just since the start of the war. Now, given that massive background and that build-up, as we know that this is the situation, we're joined today by our special guest, Professor Gil Troy from McGill University, from the Jerusalem Center for Jewish Affairs. Did I get that right?
JPPI.
JPPI. The
Jewish People Policy
the Jewish
Institute.
People Policy Institute. Sorry, I got that wrong. And we're going to discuss American Jewry. Gil's just come back from a week of lectures, of discussions with an engagement with a U.S. jury. Gil, give us a sense of what you feel is going on there. How are the Jews there still seeing this conflict? Are they still on our side? Are they still feeling the pain as we do every day?
So first, let me say what an honor it is to talk to you and how much I admire your work. And yet, when I listen to this opening of yours, it just sounds absurd. The Houthis are attacking us. We're responsible because Hamas attacked us. It's all on us. It's insane what's going on. And I think we have to kind of step out. And hearing your short summary just made me, yell for a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire from the Houthis. We need a ceasefire from Hezbollah. We need a ceasefire from Hamas. And a release of our hostages. Then we'll talk about our ceasefire. And of course, that was one of the central dynamics in my trip to the United States. I basically found 4 different groups of American Jews there. The first group, I call them the awakened warriors. Some of them have been with us from the moment of their birth. Zionism is deeply a part of their soul, deeply part of their DNA. Some of them, since October 7th, didn't realize how deeply connected they were to Israel. And that group of American Jews, which I think is the bulk of American Jewry, are still not only with us, but obsessed, doom scrolling as we are, mourning every death, watching this absurdity take place. I've never seen so many of my friends so emotionally connected to Israel and so out of sync with the broader American conversation. Because even though most Americans support Israel, the level of emotion around Israel for this core group of American Jews and the level of emotion among most Americans who just sort of moved on is very, very difficult. And so some of my friends, were hitting Super Bowl Sunday. I started my trip in Miami, jogging along the beautiful seacoast. The disconnect between normalcy and this abnormalcy is for them, and frankly for me, very, very jarring. And that's the core group that we really need to focus on. There's a second group that I call the American Jewish warriors, and they are still very much pro-Israel, very much connected to us, but they also are deeply, deeply entwined with the Democratic Party, with the Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken narrative. And increasingly, they're asking the questions, well, is this over the top? And I keep on saying, give me a better alternative. You want to criticize Israel with thunderbolts of moral judgment from what I call remote control morality from afar? Fine, do it. But first, give me an alternative. Tell me how else one should respond to Hamas, and also take some moral responsibility, as Hillary Clinton did, but few other Americans and American Jews have, for the pressure they constantly put on Israel each time Israel confronted Hamas. Everybody likes to say, oh, Bibi Netanyahu created the conceptia. And there certainly is a conversation about what happened here in Israel. But no one's taking responsibility for the fact the entire international community and much of the Jewish community was pushing this conceptia. And the other thing they keep on talking about, not only is, stop being so violent, is the two-state solution, the two-state solution, the two-state solution. To talk about the two-state solution without acknowledging the 1,000 deaths that came from Oslo and the 1,200 plus deaths that came from the disengagement is to be stuck in the 1990s. So again, I kept on saying, help me out. If you really have a vision of the two-state solution that works, start not with putting pressure on Israel, start with learning from your historical mistakes. It's not unheard of for us all to make political mistakes. To make political mistakes is excusable. Not to learn from them is inexcusable. So we have the awakened warriors. We have the increasing group of liberal warriors. We have some who are simply war weary and Israel weary, didn't want any of this headache October 7th, just want to go back to normal. And then, of course, the ones who get far too much attention are the woke warriors, a very small group, but a very fanatic group of American Jews, disproportionately young, led by groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, who are
J Street?
And J Street's different. J Street's I'll get to J Street in a second. They're in a complicated place. But the super woke are kind of just filled with pure anti-Zionist hatred and have bought into a kind of anti-Zionist ideology that makes them popular on campus, that joins them with the feminists who, after 10, 15 years of saying silence is violence and Me Too, somehow ignored the perversions and depredations and the assault on women on October 7th. And that small group gets too much attention. And one of my essential messages to American Jewry is follow the polls. Don't spend so much time focusing on both the woke Jews and the woke Americans. They are a minority. And the more we obsess about them, the more we forget that most Americans are pro-Israel. And I think that first group of American Jewish warriors has to be much more aggressive in just emphasizing what's going on in the Gallup polls, what's going on in the Harvard-Harris polls. The overwhelming majority of Americans understand that this is an existential fight for existence. And the more we emphasize that, the more the Biden administration understands that John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, who won't even call himself a progressive anymore because he sees quote unquote progressives violating core ideals, is reflective of actually many more of what I call the silenced majority. Just one quick thing about J Street. What you've seen with J Street is whereas Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, from the first day, we're joining with the Democratic Socialists of America and condemning Israel for daring to be attacked and refusing to take on any more moral responsibility. Initially, J Street, which calls itself the pro-peace, pro-Israel lobby, was very careful to condemn the Hamas attacks. By week 2 or 3, they came out with, I think, a morally reprehensible statement in which they said, "We urge Israel to take every effort to save Palestinian lives and minimize civilian damage." I'm all in favor of that too. But after October 7th, to simply throw that out there and not take some responsibility, A, for their own role, as I said earlier, in calling for ceasefires, and B, to not give suggestions that are actually realistic. How do you handle these monsters, these perverts, these killers on your doorstep? If you send them a nice thank you note, they're going to kill you. So that was morally irresponsible. And now increasingly, we're hearing J Street go further and further into the two-state solution. Stop being over the top. You're dehumanizing the Palestinians mantra, again, without going to specifics. So they've been actually moving, and I hope that they don't reflect where the American Jewish community or the American conversation is going. And it's on us to make sure that we put the brakes on that kind of moral confusion.
Yeah, Gil, just a word about J Street. It's been our assessment that more and more the J Street incantation of two-state solutions, their constant warnings to Israel, reflect a conception that they had that, in our view, led in part to October 7th massacre. It was the constant kissing and hugging of Jeremy Ben-Ami, of Mahmoud Abbas every time he would come to the United States, the uncritical reception, the uncritical acceptance of the PA's incentivization to terror, known as pay for slay, incitement to terror, remuneration of terror, the irresponsible insistence that pay for slay was merely a Social Security line item, which is absolutely 180 degrees away from the facts of the case, that makes J Street, in our assessment, part of the very problematic pathway that led to October 7th. And they have taken no responsibility for that. And I would go further to say that while Jeremy Ben-Ami himself is a progressive Zionist, the vast majority of people under the J Street tent, it would be very hard-pressed to categorize them as progressive Zionists.
I'll see you and raise you. I simply go to the fact that every single Gaza Israel clash, going back to since the establishment of J Street, which is shortly after the disengagements around the Obama years, every single time they called for a ceasefire, every single time they immediately put pressure on Israel to stop. And that stop led to the bloodbath of October 7th. And maybe I missed it, but I have not heard anyone from within the J Street community take responsibility, again, in the way that Hillary Clinton did. And so I call this part of the American Jewish conceptia and part of the American conceptia. And it's so easy. I have a long list. I'm working on an article where, the Washington Post and the New York Times all explain the conceptia by throwing Bibi Netanyahu under the bus and saying that Bibi Netanyahu was trying to undermine the two-state solution. We've heard this again and again. And never do they take responsibility for the fact that those people pushing for the two-state solution were also claiming that Hamas is pragmatic, they have to deal with Hamas, that you can't be too violent. And they were the ones who were encouraging Qatar to bring them money, as much as some of the Israelis who misread the situation too. So it's very, very easy to blame the one person you dislike. And it's much harder to take responsibility for a broad-based blind spot that became that sort of united left and right in a very bizarre way. But I agree that J Street has been irresponsible and reprehensible and not taking responsibility for their words.
One of the people that has been very responsible and in fact quite instructive is Over Your Right Shoulder. I think it's a book that you co-authored or authored with Natan Sharansky. And former Deputy Prime Minister Sharansky has said on numerous occasions that it's very difficult for people on the political, on the moderate right to pull back people on the further to the right, and people on the moderate left to pull back their fellow journeymen on the journey people on the far left. Just picking up on what you were talking about in terms of the American Jewish community, which is primarily a liberal, it's primarily a liberal community, ranging from liberal to progressive to even left of progressive. What has been so difficult in this era of massacre, or in this moment of massacre, I should say, in which, as you said very eloquently, as you always are, that discussing a two-state solution today is nothing more than a prize for genocide. Clearly, the logic would go massacre and torture, rape and pillage Israeli women, children, and men, and hey, you can pressure Israel for a state. And the question becomes, what is it in the American Jewish anthropological, sociological setup that would prevent them from saying to the administration, this is crazy right now. It may not have been crazy on October the 5th, but it's really crazy right now even to talk about that.
It goes very deep into ideology and sociology. And, we have to start off first with acknowledgement of the good that, especially in the first couple of weeks, Joe Biden got up there and said, don't. And all of us here in Jerusalem and in Israel were so thrilled when the Gerald R. Ford and other Air Force carriers and submarines came to support us. And that was a moment of a kind of pure consensus where American Jewry, the administration, and Israel were in sync. But with each passing week, two things happen. One is that fundamentally, if we really want to talk about the conception before October 7th, we really have to talk about the difficulty for the transactional mind, the rational mind, the liberal mind to accept the apocalyptic mind of Hezbollah, of the Houthis, and Hamas. And if you can't accept the fact that these people aren't happy with every single inch of Gaza territory, where they could have built a beautiful Middle Eastern Riviera, but instead chose to create Hamasistan because they have an apocalyptic mind. They don't have a transactional mind. On October 7th, people saw that apocalyptic mind in the most brutal way possible. And they saw that these people had been raised to hate Jews so much, right? It was very interesting, even in Israel, we saw this as a Jew hating moment, not just an Israel hating moment. They hate them so much they didn't even stick to their plan, because had they stuck to their plan, they would have advanced more into Israeli territory, but they were so busy massacring. So there was a moment of understanding. But with each passing week, two things happen. One, the media conversation and the university conversation, which are the two places where American Jews most worship, becomes more and more anti-Israel. And that's why I think there really has to be a strategic move on the part of American Jewry to bring out the silenced majority, bring out the overwhelming majority of Americans who are with Israel. So the more that conversation builds, the harder it is for you to hold the line. And the more you fall back into your transactional conception of, oh, if we only gave them a two-state solution, if we only gave them more power, if we only gave them concessions, then they'd be happy. But they have to acknowledge that. And the sociology of it is really, what team are you on? And the more people don't think that John Fetterman, who was a Pennsylvania Democrat, who came into office as super progressive and still is on all those domestic issues that are so important to most American Jews, but has a clear moral line. And it's interesting, I'm using the word moral, not political. This isn't about politics. This is about moral. There's a clear moral line in the sand. The more you think he's an outlier, because he seems to be vis-a-vis the New York Times, Washington Post conversation, the less you're going to go with him. But the more you understand that he actually reflects middle America and Mr. and Mrs. America, not the campus and not the New York Times, the more you're going to say, wait a minute, we need a reconceptualization. So both sociologically, they're threatened by the people they worship turning on them. And ideologically, it's very hard to sit with the evil, because good and evil are these moral apocalyptic terms, and they want a solution.
I think down there,
I want a solution too, of course.
I think there's a connection between all of those dots that you can really make. Whilst on the one hand, the apocalyptical situation that we found ourselves in on the 7th of October clearly demonstrated that the conflict that we're in has nothing to do with territory. It's all about violence. It's all about the rejection of Iran, its proxies, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, Hezbollah, about any Jewish existence in this area. And then on the other hand, almost the progressive approach that says, well, we don't want to talk about anything that's ideological because we don't really accept that as an ideological basis. So let's talk practically about going back to this land for peace idea, that there has to be the solution, that it can't be ideological, because that's almost saying that if it's an ideological conflict, then there possibly isn't a solution to it. So if we can impose this geographical solution, then maybe we can find some type of a common ground.
Right, it's salami tactics, right? You take any conflict, you divide it in half, give you a little piece, you a little piece, and I'll be happy. And Israelis did that in the 1947 partition, and we were happy and they weren't. I want to add another dimension to this, which is very important when you talk about the American situation. Look what's happened since October 7th. The Rockefeller Center tree lighting ceremony disrupted. Red paint representing blood splashed on the White House and the Lincoln Memorial. Traffic disrupted during Christmas time on the way to JFK Airport in New York and LAX Airport in Los Angeles. Sloan Kettering Memorial Institute, a cancer institute. The Los Angeles Veterans Cemetery with 80,000 veterans, all attacked, not by Jews. And by the way, one of the heartbreaking moments I had on my trip was a student asked me, said, what about the charge of dual loyalty that we get from the far left and the far right? I said, dual loyalty? Look at who's attacking American icons. Look who's attacking American institutions. If you had any doubt that this is civilizational, that this is really about Jews and Americans and Westerners and liberal Democrats all on one side, and a group of jihadists who are echoing crazy Soviet ideas from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, resurrecting Marxism, echoing totalitarianism on the other side, then their behavior has shown it. I'm a bit of a free speech absolutist, so I'm actually far less interested in stopping them and more interested in putting a spotlight on them, because we see that that American, want to talk about intersectionality, anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism are intersecting, are intertwined. And we have to make the American argument that this is an assault on American icons, on American values, on American history, on American essence. And that's why this is really such an important fight. And we have to make sure that Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken, who originally saw that, Joe Biden in a very powerful way, keep doing that, as opposed to getting distracted by the New York Times articles and Thomas Friedman's latest conversation with some cab driver that then becomes, oh my goodness, Thomas Friedman says this and that, and we have to quit and give up.
It seems, Gil, that there are a couple of issues here that would love you to weigh in on. One is it appears from here that the American administration is following the Obama administration blueprint by viewing the Iranian regime as the solution to the problem as opposed to the source of the problem, where Israel sees the Iranian, we call it the Iranian octopus, with its tentacles reaching down in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen and Iraq and across the Middle East as the source of the problem. Now that sounds very nice as a 1-minute analysis. The bigger problem, it appears, arises by which it seems from here that the administration, in order to complete its modeling, has actually, similar to the Obama administration, they have platformed Israel as the center of the problem, because if we don't accept the two-state solution, which according to the argument it assesses is the focus of the Middle East problem, and that which enrages or inflames the Iranian issue, that if we don't accomplish that, then everything spins out of control. When I think in truth and in fact, it's completely the other way around. How do we handle that discussion?
I have a little bit of a problem. I'm an American historian, and I was trained in American history, in the history of American foreign policy, in America during World War II, in American conceptions. And as an American, it is simply incomprehensible to me. Put Israel aside. It is incomprehensible to me that 180 attacks would be launched by quote unquote Iranian proxies against the United States of America, resulting in the death of 3 Americans, and by the way, the brain trauma to many, many others, to dozens of others. And that rather than going after, as you said, the head of the snake, the center of the octopus, the source of the problem, the United States of America would continue to just go after the proxies, which means that they're playing on the Iranian field. And that's exactly the mistake that the Obama administration made when they were negotiating on the nuclear treaty. It was always on Iranian terms, always on the Iranian domain rather than the American domain. And I think that we have to make the American-based argument, which is that when somebody attacks you, you attack back. And, my other problem is I read. So when I read the Hamas charter saying it wants to destroy Israel, even before October 7th, I took it seriously. So October 7th was to me devastating, but not surprising. When we read what the mullahs in Iran say about little Satan, that's merely Israel. Big Satan is the United States of America. Who's more Islamophobic? If I say, oh, they're just a bunch of Muslims, don't take their words seriously, I call that Islamophobia. I take them seriously. I take them at their words. I see that not all Muslims, but Islamists have an apocalyptic mindset. And I understand that the Iranians are very cleverly pushing pieces all over the world chessboard without paying the price. And we have to go in and knock out the chess master, not the pawns.
That's really exactly true, Gil. I think that this idea of the world actually taking, let's focus just for a second on the Palestinians and taking them seriously for really what they say every day to the Palestinian population, what they say their intentions are, what the Hamas charter said, what the PLO charter said that hasn't been changed. All of these things say we reject Israel's right to exist and we will fight until we have destroyed Israel. Now, and it's almost, I would go further that it's not even Islamophobic. I would say that it's actually racist to the extent that you're saying, well, these people don't even understand the simple words that they are saying. They are clearly simpletons. They don't really mean what they're saying. And that is fundamentally racist in that it doesn't.
Bigotry, absolutely.
It's bigotry. It doesn't give these people even the respect that they understand what they're saying. Because that's part of that rejection of reality. Because if we actually hear what they're saying and actually take them seriously for what they're saying, well, the result is completely diametrically opposed to anything that we want to impose on this situation. They become the problem and not Israel.
It's actually a kind of arrogance of projecting your own sense of who you are and how you approach problems on others. We saw this again. I always like to go out of the Israel situation because the Israel situation is so fraught. Look at the Arab Spring. All of a sudden, we decided when we watched the Arab Spring, oh, Google is happening and social media is happening, and therefore the Arab world is going to evolve very quickly overnight into becoming liberal democracies like us. It sounded like a compliment, but it actually was an act of arrogant projectionism. It was assuming that the political culture there is the same as the political culture in New York, in California, in the UK, and it's just not. So I think that this has been the ongoing mistake that American foreign policy makers make. And it's one thing when it's we just sort of sitting there from afar and watching the Arab Spring. But when our kids' lives are on the line, look, we saw October 7th, it's not just our kids, our lives are on the line. And by the way, that goes back to what I'm saying about American Jewry. American Jews understood in a very profound way that this was an attack on them too. When we see the depth of the evil and the depth of the hatred, and again, this apocalyptic mindset, it is very important for us to figure out new ways of fighting that. Not just we're seeing, you talked about the tunnels, extraordinary improvisations in urban warfare, extraordinary attempts, by the way, to save civilian lives. I got into trouble because I was asked to apologize for Israel, and I refused to, because I think Israel has nothing to apologize for and much to be proud of. So we see in the same way that Israel is improvising tactically, militarily, we in the West, and we are part of the West, have to start improvising ideologically. And to see people so stuck in the 1990s, to see people so stuck in the conceptia of October 6th, to see people so stuck in previous assumptions without willing to learn anything is quite terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted just to what they used to say at Harvard Business School is to chip shot on what Gil just said, which he uses as a platform.
That's very waspy of you.
It is. It
Very
is
Sunday golf.
very Sunday golf into clubs that we would not be accepted as members.
Yes.
Gil, here is another picture that we're trying to understand. The extraordinary reaction across American cities on October 7th and 8th, not 3.5 weeks later when the IDF went into Gaza in a retaliatory strike, but the extraordinary genocidal rhetoric that embraced the Hamas, embraced its genocidal incantation from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, sent shockwaves through Israel because it essentially deepened what had been, I think, a more superficial understanding of what anti-Semitism was versus, people used to throw around it's anti-Zionist, it's not anti-Semitism, but watching the venal hatred on these campuses and in American cities. It's not, we were watching New York shutting down Grand Central Station twice, the police not doing anything about it, really created a sense of Germany in the 1930s. And one wonders, how was the perfect storm, in your view, created in which one of the worst massacres in modern history, frankly, in one day, against the Jewish people, ended up triggering one of the most enthusiastic responses to massacre, I think, ever in the modern period?
It was absolutely stunning and very painful. And that's one of the things I kept on saying on campus. I'm saying, if on October 7th, you're pro-Palestinian and your super woke friends, whatever you want to call them, social justice warrior, take whatever phrase you want, had come to you and said, wow, this is really awful. I just want to sit with you. And then 2-3 days later, even let alone 2-3 weeks later, then started protesting against the bombing. Then you say, okay, we're having a debate about Israel's tactics, what Israel does. But the zeal, the venom, the exhilaration, as one fellow historian from Cornell used the word, of the bloodbath. This is what decolonialism looks like. That showed that it wasn't about what Israel does, it's what Israel is. Mm-hmm. And your question now was, where does this come from? And let's look at 3 data points. We don't have time to go into a longer analysis. But number one, I think there is the weird, bizarre way in which Palestinians have been blackened. And Palestinians have been embraced by the civil rights movement, and Palestinians have been given a free pass. When we first started learning the phrase Black Lives Matter, a university president in Wellesley said, "Well, yes, I agree, all lives matter," and she was almost forced to resign because Black Lives Matter said, "No, don't do that. Don't what about it? Don't overly generalize." But somehow, around the George Floyd issue in 2020, when Palestinians said Palestinian lives matter, and Palestinians literally hijacked symbols from Ferguson to Gaza and George Floyd and the chokehold, all of a sudden they got a free pass. And over the last 40 years, we've seen this free pass from the far left, from the civil rights movement. So somehow the Palestinians were given a special status. That's number one. Number two is we've seen, and Natan Sharansky has been fighting this for decades, we've seen the injection of a kind of Soviet totalitarian approach in our intellectual centers, especially on our campuses, that is deeply anti-Semitic, but as I say, and we have to keep on emphasizing, deeply anti-American. And those two background forces were building, and created, if we look at May 2021, we see kind of the conditions were already there, were already ripe. But since then, we have to add a third element, which is the polarization in America, where you're either on one side of Donald Trump or another side of Donald Trump. So a thoughtful critique of the far left wasn't allowed because Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis also critique the far left, also critique woke, also critique this totalitarianism. So if you do that, then therefore, if you agree with them on anything, you must be evil like them. Shut down the conversation. And so on October 7th, these and other factors came together such that feminists, as I said earlier, who had built their entire identity in the last 10, 15 years of having zero tolerance for gendered violence, as they should, because that's their core identity, were so tied into their identity as part of this totalitarian social justice warrior woke world that they couldn't respond to the facts. And I'm going to boast, I was the first person, I think, to write an article saying, where are the feminists? And it only came out in tablet. I tried to get it in mainstream American media. We weren't ready to publish it. It came out in tablet at the end of October, and I kept on waiting. I wanted a woman to preempt me. Usually, as a writer, you want to be the first. Here, I wanted somebody else from within the movement to show some integrity. And that came out at the end of October. Read the statement of NOW, the National Organization of Women, on November 30th, 2 months later. They do finally condemn rape and sexual violence, but they don't use the words Hamas, October 7th, Israel. It's as if they just decided, happy Thanksgiving. Over Thanksgiving turkey, we decided the next day to come out with a statement condemning rape. Not in context, not connected, because they're afraid. They're afraid of crossing these clear red lines. And that is toxic to a democracy. We cannot have a feminist movement which doesn't denounce gendered violence. We can't have a liberal movement which somehow supports this illiberal totalitarianism on campus, in the media, and certainly in the Palestinian Authority. We can't have organizations that are so ideologically pure, and I put that in quotation marks, because they have to be on one side that they can't struggle with the complexities of life. And that's terrifying, again, as an American. I think more and more we have to put this on American liberal terms, because this is an assault on America. This is an assault on liberalism. This is an assault on, what do we call it? Truthiness. And we've got to call them out.
But this is an assault, Gil. From all of that description, as you said to me about the introduction, what you described now seems to me to be very, very clear. If you're incapable of accepting the fact that Jews were slaughtered because they are Jews, women were raped because they are Jews, you're silent in the face of all of this clearly sectorial religious violence, and you're incapable of seeing that anti-Semitism is the same as anti-Zionism. There is no difference between the two, and you're still pushing those same ideas. Nothing has changed with these organizations. They haven't said, you know what, the two-state solution, empowering these religious fanatics who hate everything that is liberal, that everything that is a Western value, would just be a bad idea. You cannot create another Islamic fundamentalist state that will kill, rape, murder, behead, torture. And yet they don't seem to have moved in their position even one iota. How does that fit in with their liberalism and wokeism, and if it's not just pure anti-Semitism?
So look, clearly anti-Semitism is playing a part. And but for example, I don't think, when I look at what's going on now with the Biden administration, I think it's more kind of sloppiness and a misreading of the political situation, because again, I think we're focusing on the conversation as it is rather than where the American people are at, than anti-Semitism. Because I think there was extraordinary support from Biden himself and Blinken initially. Now, one of the things that Biden is dealing with is that when you go lower down in the administration, the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds, not every 20-year-old, not every 30-year-old, but many of them who work for Biden are writing these ridiculous letters, protesting with masks. And the reason why I said the letters are ridiculous is because they don't sign their names, attacking Biden and buying into this whole notion that he's Genocide Joe. And at a moment when the presidential election campaign is starting to heat up and Biden's position is so fraught, he's responding to the noise. And that's why I think it's really important. There's a really important moment for American Jewish organizations, because again, speaking to many of my American Jewish leadership friends, many of my American Jewish friends who were traumatized by October 7th and are still in the trauma, they get it. But they have to start unleashing the power of middle America, unleashing the power of that core American decency. And even if it rhymes with certain Republican memes and positions, even if it rhymes occasionally with Donald Trump's position, they've got to emphasize that this is a civilizational conflict. Actually, I don't even like calling it a civilization conflict because it implies the other side is civilized. They're not. They choose again and again to use the symbols of Western civilization, as you pointed out so eloquently at the beginning, to hide behind hospitals, mosques, tunnels, UNRWA. So this is a conversation that has to happen within the American Jewish community of how do we mobilize and how do we create new partnerships between people who get it, even if they support Trump, even if we've disagreed with them before, even if, let's say, we don't agree with them on abortion. This has to be an issue because, again, it's not simply about supporting Israel. It's about fighting anti-Americanism at the core of many American institutions.
The consensus needs to be there, which I think maybe now, for fear of overstepping my mark as the Englishman on the group, maybe this plays directly into the Robert Kraft's advertisement tonight for the Super Bowl. That's just talking about anti-Semitism and the rise in anti-Semitism. That 1 in 4, according to the advertisement, 1 in 4 Americans has experienced anti-Semitism just since the October 7th, and that's a staggering number. And that would appear to be completely contradictory to where Middle America seems to be. Middle America seems to be supportive of proper, true American values that don't accept what was done. And then you're just hearing this very, very fringe voice that's very, very loud and possibly amplified, taking over the discussion. Gil, as unfortunately as is often, far too often the case with these briefings, we've come to the end of the time before the end of the discussion. If I can just ask you to leave us, as I do with everyone, leave us with one positive message going forward. Where are we going to be in the next week, month, year? So
I'll do 2 positive messages. One of the things I really felt in the American Jewish community was the sense of renewal, the sense of awakening, the sense of commitment. And by the way, I was at Hillel, and the questions that I got, even the ones that were a little bit critical, were so respectful, so thoughtful, so substantive, so unlike the stereotype we get of the woke student. So as always, I find there's a decency in America and in American Jews. There's a commitment and a love for Israel in American Jews, which doesn't make the headlines. And to me, that gets into my broader point, which is for all the pain and all the suffering and all the heroism that your kids and so many others have demonstrated, have been forced to demonstrate in the last couple of months, we have seen a Zionist renewal. We're seeing in the streets of Israel, and frankly, in New York, in Florida, in Boston, in Washington, where I went, people, Jews, understanding that if we don't exercise this muscle of love, exercise this muscle of belief, exercise this muscle of Zionist idealism, we will lose. And I've seen an exercise both in the United States of America and in Israel and many other Jewish communities around the world that we really have to appreciate and keep exercising. And that's our future, that we really are going to win because we are on the side of right. We are on the side of the decent American majority. And we also have no choice because we are fighting a cult of death, and we will prevail because we are people who choose life.
Gil, it's really a pleasure and an honor to hear your insights, especially as we move to a period in which, those of us in the world Jewish community can stand together and assert that to talk about something like a cult of death or a moment, what you called apocryphal moment, you called it, or a messianic moment. I wasn't sure the nomenclature that Gil used.
Apocalyptic.
October 7th.
Apocalyptic moment.
But it does not necessarily transform a personality away from being a liberal, rational American Jew to be able to call out that type of darkness and messianic behavior, evil behavior on the part of Hamas. So I hope we continue, and others, and I hope we can continue to have this conversation as a way of really coalescing the American Jewish community together with the Israeli Jewish community, an important moment. So thank you ever so much for joining us. We'll look forward to having you over for lunch, dinner, and continuing this conversation, and should be well and safe, and your children as well as ours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gil.
And thank you very much to our audience. And Lise, thank you for all of your comments. We are seeing them, but we're having a little bit of a timing problem at the moment. We hopefully will address them at a later stage. Thank you all for joining us as ever. We will be back with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time. We hope to see you then. In the meantime, have a good evening, afternoon, day, whatever it is, and keep safe. And maybe your team will win the Super Bowl. Good luck.
All the best.
Goodbye.
Taylor Swift will definitely win.